You are entering the vicinity of an area adjacent to a location. The kind of place where there might be a monster or some kind of weird mirror. These are just examples. It could also be something much better. Prepare to enter through Ultan's door.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl.
Through Ultan's Door is an adventure zine written by Ben Lawrence. For this episode, we will be discussing issue number 1 of that zine. Issue 1 features artwork by Huargo, Russ Nicholson, and Gus L., with cartography by Gus L. and layout by Matt Hildebrand. The text begins with an introduction in which we learn a little bit about the fantastic dream city of Zion and its 3 parts: Zion above, Zion between, and Zion below. The introduction ends by telling us that, fantastic as the dream city is, we're beginning our adventure in the mundane, waking world. From there it moves to a section called Ultan's Door. Here we learn of a printmaker named Ultan who, quote, while laying poison for rats in his shop just off the square of Eidolons, is said to have come across a door under his stairs. This printmaker claims that this doorway was not there as recently as the previous day, and even more implausibly, that it leads to the sewers of Zion, the infamous floating city of Wishery. Word has spread quietly amongst the clientele of the Mercury Whistle that Ultan is charging 10 gold pieces a head for entrance, no questions asked. This section includes 2 tables, rumours about Ultan's Door and reasons for venturing through Ultan's Door. The next section is Ultan's Shop, where we learn more about Ultan himself and his nephew Samir, and how to run the encounter there.
Next is a section called Through Ultan's Door. Here we learn that Ultan's Door opens up to the ruins of the Inquisitor's Theatre, and we're introduced to the main factions that hold sway in the ruins. The Guildless, who are citizens of Zion who have committed shameful crimes and been stripped of the masks the Zionese wear. The White Swine, who are gross, cunning pig creatures with the hands of small children, and the Weaver of Shadows, a spider demon that figures prominently in the story. This section also includes an encounter table. The bulk of the text is taken up by the key, which details the 30 keyed locations that make up the dungeons. Some highlights here include the Theater of Punishments, where the massive Queen Sow of the White Swine is hidden. The Temple of the Holy Puppets, where a trio of puppet automata holds sway. Shaltrom and his apprentices, members of the Guildless dedicated to something called the Pickled Prince. The Scriptorium, featuring a tree whose silvery fruit imparts any who consume them with knowledge of Zion's elaborate criminal laws. And the Lair of the Weaver of Shadows. Next is a short bestiary. Then we have a short section on spells. There's then a short section called Champions, which details how your characters change if they have certain interactions with the Weaver of Shadows. And we'll kind of wrap up here by noting that the physical version of the zine has a nice map inside a detachable cover. This is reproduced in the PDF, as well as a separate reference card with encounter tables on it. This is also reproduced in the PDF. Tom, how have you used Through Ultan's Door in your games? And we should mention here really quickly, as in the interest of full disclosure, that Ben sent us both copies of the zine. Just want to throw that out there to make sure people know that. But yeah, you've just read it, right?
I have only read it, I'm afraid. How about you?
I have played this issue of Through Ultan's Door over the course of 2 sessions using Trophy Gold. I played them over the Thanksgiving holiday with a group of people who had never played a role-playing game before. This was their first role-playing game experience, and that was very interesting. Yeah, it's a little bit outside the scope of our discussion, but it was interesting. They had a really good time, but they definitely did not get giant rats and skeletons.
Rats in the basement, no.
yeah, didn't get that. So yeah, they might have been a better introduction to role-playing games, honestly. So, what do we like about Through Ultan's Door? From a read, what do you think, Tom?
The thing that strikes me most about Zion, the main setting of this, is that it's a dream realm that I like. Dream kingdoms, dream worlds, dream sequences in RPGs are, in my experience, generally terrible. I may have done a small rant about this in a previous episode, I can't remember. But generally, it's difficult to know what the stakes are. Like, you you're never that sure if something is a good or bad idea, because, it's sort of, oh, it turns out you could have leapt across that impossible chasm because you've got dream powers, or no, that's ridiculous, you fail immediately. It often feels like not just gotcha GMing, but a gotcha setting. But Cyan feels both genuinely kind of oniric and also concrete, so that you can explore it in a meaningful way. And that really appeals to me. It also helps that for some reason it kind of reminds me of a recurring dream I had many years ago in a hotel about being in a weird hotel, especially in that it feels like it's a large place. But if you look at the map, there's not that many locations. They're all quite close together. And that's often how places feel in dreams, I think. It seems quite, I was about to say true to life, but true to imagination, I guess.
I'm with you on this. I don't love dream world fiction. I like classic things like, Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz and things like that. But I think that those have stood the test of time precisely because they're rooted with, or they're grounded in a sort of like, social statement. In the case of Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz has like this very like kind of, this big message about like growing up and expectations that we put on like on young women, especially. Right. And so I kind of deal with those, but in general, I don't care for dream world fiction. For a lot of the reasons you kind of suggested, is sometimes it feels too limitless in a way that makes the stakes feel wonky of whatever the story is. I've had some bad experiences in games. I did kind of a dream world thing in Dungeon World fairly recently, about a year ago, where it was this tavern that had like an impossible number of like rooms and layers to it, and the players had a really good time, but I didn't have a good time. I was running, I mean, I created it. I had good intentions, but I ended up not really liking it because it felt so unbelievable and so limitless, and everything just became kind of like strange and surreal and ultimately kind of pointless, right? Like it wasn't really like grounded to anything. And I think I could have like set that session up in a way where it wouldn't have been that way, but it just came off that way. And I've always had that kind of experience with dream world fiction. The stakes don't feel real. Nothing feels, it just, I don't know, like there's something about like taking fantasy to the, to 11 and thereby making that fantasy feel not special, right? It's why I don't love Numenera, for example, or settings that are incredibly ornate, what I call ornateness, settings that have a lot of ornateness, meaning they have lots of like strange aesthetics going on, lots of unbelievable things, lots of hard to describe things. It's hard, I feel alienated by settings like that, right? As a general matter. And all that is just to say, I agree with you. I didn't feel that way about this. There were lots of hints of like a sort of more grand meandering dream world, especially in the introduction part. But the actual dungeon part that you do doesn't really have that feeling. It's still like quite enjoyable and fantastic. It's not as alienating as a lot of dream world fiction, I guess is what I'm getting at. I'm agreeing with you. What else? And we can kind of get into some of the details later, but what else did you like about this? I mean,
yeah, let's talk about the kind of implied or assumed adventure sequence, which is that I like that the intro is about coming from the waking world, and it talks, you spend about 3 sections, I think, on the shop that you're in and like getting through the door and so on. I think it's very Chronicles of Narnia in a way, all that business about how you find the doorway in a otherwise unremarkable place. Yeah, it reminds me of Planescape as well, which had all that business about kind of finding portals in the city into different places.
Yeah, I think that's a strength here for sure. It definitely has the setup, like how you kind of get into the adventure, and then the actual setting itself, at least this little tiny slice of it that we've gotten in this dungeon. It does feel really familiar, but, like you said, Narnia, Labyrinth, all that kind of stuff. I was wondering, I was desperately, sort of, not desperately, but I was very like concerned that we were going to do like Labyrinth in the companion adventures for the 10th time. I mean, this is probably the most Labyrinth-like of all the ones we've covered. You can definitely tell that there's some familiarity there. There's a lot of like familiar themes and beats kind of going on. I still think it feels really fresh. Like once you kind of get into the dungeon, I think that the ecology of the dungeon, the different types of fantastic creatures that you encounter, the way it kind of manages this tone that kind of straddles light adventure type fantasy with like kind of very dark, like kind of wicked fantasy, I think is really great. And so it feels really fresh while also feeling kind of familiar in ways. And I thought that was a strength overall.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that's very interesting about it is it's It's really super zoomed in room by room exploration stuff, which avoids the trap, or from a read, I think it avoids the trap of turning into those guess what the writer was thinking puzzles. It just gives you these interesting things to explore. So it seems like kind of quite gritty OSR dungeoneering in its sort of presentation, but it also stays true to that dream concept. It's not just a dungeon that in theory is in the Dreamlands. It does have these kind of weird, very iconic images. Things like, I mean, there's a lot of sinister puppets in this, which for me, you can never go wrong with a sinister puppet. And it has these very striking things that are both quite detailed, like talking about, the ecology, how the white swine live. But it does seem like those kind of powerful sensations that you get in dreams sometimes, like when you have a quite plot-heavy dream that doesn't really, when you wake up, you still feel tired. And sometimes you have really detailed things going on in dreams, but they have this weird intensity, which is the, surrealism was originally based on the idea that dreams are hyper-real. And I think that's what's going on here. You have this sort of squalid white swine who live in absolute horrible, filthy, pig-breeding conditions. And that's presented really vividly in a way that is it grotesque? It certainly borders on grotesque, I would say.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I'll just kind of piggyback there and say, huh? I think the bestiary here is really great. I loved it. And I don't necessarily mean the section in the text called bestiary, which just has 2 monsters in it, but rather the full sweep of creatures and kind of strange characters that you encounter in the dungeon. I think that's a real strength here. I mean, this whole dungeon kind of feels like a really, really awesome monster manual kind of come to life, right? The white swine, just these upright, kind of gross, giggling, like pig creatures with little childlike hands kind of roaming around. Like, that's pretty creepy, right? It's whimsical, but also like creepy and gross. And I thought that was really great. I was personally very bothered by the idea of their white feces everywhere. That really, that really bugged me. Like, it was unnerving to me, in a way. Like, every time I read it, I was like, oh God, there's that white pig shit again. The puppets, like you said, one of the monsters that's actually in the bestiary called the Oniric Pudding, that's probably one of my favorite monsters in recent memory. I was just reading the entry for that. I did get to use it too when I ran it. And it's a really, really fun monster because it's a pudding, but it's a dream pudding, right? And I grabbed a little bit of text here if you don't mind.
Sure.
When it senses the presence of a conscious being, the Oniric Pudding draws on its stores of symbols and images to produce a vignette to attract its prey. This will usually be some dreamlike scene. For example, a king feeds swans into a spaghetti press out of which come strands of starlight, or a beautiful woman nurses a white lobster at her breast while crooning a soothing lullaby. When within striking range, the scene melts away and the ooze attacks. If the ooze is slain, it will slowly liquesce, running rapidly through forms as it dissipates. A swarm of butterflies, the head of a giant baby, a piece of the moon, etc. It will leave behind 1 pint per HD of oniric residue that can be collected in flasks. This monster is such a great example of what we've kind of been talking about. It's a dreamlike monster. It has dreamlike functions, but it's very much part of an ecology, right? It has a way that it functions. It has, even at the end there, we're told like what kind of treasure you can get from its body, right? I mean, it's grounded in something. And I think that's what makes this dreamlike setting like tolerable, and indeed enjoyable. So yeah, I love the bestiary. And if I'd like to go ahead and just transition to some of the technical aspects of this book as well, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. Because I think that something that Ben deserves a huge amount of credit for here is the writing. I found the writing to be exceptional, and in different ways too. The language is quite ornate, but in a way that I found intriguing and challenging. Like, I think I have a pretty like solid vocabulary, a pretty extensive vocabulary. I'm an attorney. I know lots of big law words, right?
Yeah. And you play D&D, so you know lots of weird polearm names.
Exactly. I do. Yeah. I don't normally run into texts where I like don't know the definitions of things, but I actually kind of did here. I had to look up a few words when I was reading this, and it was kind of fun because I was kind of enjoying this sort of very like flowery language that Ben used. It was kind of enjoyable to interact with. So that was actually pretty good. It's very beautiful. I think what I just read about the Oniric Pudding is a good example. Like, just there's this nice descriptive quality to the writing, which I thought was really great. But it's also a well-written module from the perspective of how the keyed locations are presented. I know you had some notes about this, and I want to follow up on it, but go ahead and just kick us off there.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, yeah, what I noticed was that Ben he's used what journalists call the inverse pyramid thing, which is where you put the most important stuff at the beginning. As the importance of the information dwindles, it goes further and further down. So in each keyed location, the first paragraph is a description, sometimes with some fancy words in it, of the first things you see or otherwise perceive when you arrive at that place. The following paragraphs will be, as you explore more deeply, you get more detail. And that avoids one of the classic pitfalls of bad dungeon writing. And that's where you'll get through maybe several paragraphs of detail about tablecloths or whatever. And then in the center of the dining room, a 3-meter high obelisk crackles with lime green coruscations, which is probably going to be the first thing you would notice, and maybe the thing you need to respond to. And so, he's very, quite consciously as well, because you can tell from the paragraph breaks, split this, and it's systematic, and he never tells you that, but you understand it instinctively how you're supposed to use the keyed locations as you read through because of how it's structured, which is good stuff.
And in play, it's damn helpful. It makes a huge difference. I mean, because I ran it in Trophy Gold, which means I kind of divided the dungeon up into sets, but the sets were just different segments of the dungeon. So as they were going through the rooms, I was just reading off the keyed locations, right? And the way he has like the first paragraphs being the most important things that your characters would first see is super helpful. Like, because it's basically what you have to tell them when they walk in, right? And then the rest of it, you kind of like unfurl as they investigate or whatever. Very, very helpful. I have tried to do this with other modules, like just kind of running it straight from the keys. And like you said, the poorly written ones, especially, and this is especially the case of some older ones, but the poorly written ones they're a pain in the butt. Yep. Because like you don't know where to start. You don't know what to like tell the players, right? I actually kind of appreciate something that has kind of fallen away a little bit, I feel like, in more recent years. But back in the day, they used to do the little box text, right? That like was the thing that you read to the players as they walked in the room. And that can feel a little artificial sometimes, but that's actually pretty helpful because like it's the thing that the players must know as they walk in, right? I'm thinking of Ravenloft, for example. Ravenlofts are very, very good. That's a great module in lots of ways, but one of the really like big strengths of it is it's so easy to run because of those little boxed bits, right? And this is a similar thing. Like the first paragraph is the stuff that they see. It's the stuff that they won't miss, right? It made running it a real pleasure, frankly. Some other things, sort of in terms of presentation, the illustrations are quite good. I enjoyed all of them. They are not necessarily unified in style, but I am a lot more forgiving of that in a zine product. I always kind of like have a little more wiggle room in terms of my expectations when it comes to zines. Not that I'm like dialing them down, but I kind of appreciate the somewhat more like kind of DIY quality of a zine, right? As an aesthetic, I appreciate that. And so this somewhat mismatched art like kind of still manages to work. It still like looks great and feels good. I think if it was a bigger product, it probably wouldn't come off as well. But that might just be my bias. I don't know. Yeah,
I was impressed by the artwork as well, especially the illustration on page 22, if you have a copy to hand.
It's good, yeah.
It's really good. And it reminds me of the kind of classic Games Workshop Warhammer artwork around not really in the earlier Enemy Within adventures that we've reviewed on this podcast, but starting to come in around Power Behind the Throne, kind of when they started doing more stuff to do with chaos and demons, like in the late 80s. And in fact, Through Ultan's Door has one smallish Russ Nicholson illustration, and he worked on a lot of Warhammer stuff and fighting fantasy back in the heyday of that, Warlock of Firetop Mountain and everything. So yeah, I like that art style. Probably because it's what I grew up with, but I think it's pretty well done here. Like you say, the art style doesn't quite match, but it's usually far enough apart from the next piece along that I think it's not too jarring.
It all manages to work, even though there are like 3 or 4 distinct styles kind of going on. Another thing, the physical presentation is really good here. I don't normally work with physical products. I prefer PDFs actually, but Ben sent us these and I'm glad he did. The paper quality of the zine is very, very nice. I appreciated that. It was a pleasure to kind of like just hold and read. The detached cover with the map is is ingenious. I love that. Super helpful at the table too. And then a little encounter table card. It comes with this little card of encounter tables, which is also surprisingly useful because we've talked about on this show before what a pain in the butt it is to have to be flipping around for the encounter tables in the middle of the adventure, right? So it's kind of nice to have them, off to the side. So physically, just very, very, very cool.
Yeah. Those two bits with the card and the cover. It's such a sort of simple presentation trick, but really effective. I got to admit, I was enthralled like a simpleton by the detachable cover when I first opened this thing, and I just go, ooh, look at that. But fortunately for my self-image, everyone else that I've shown it to has also had exactly the same reaction. They all go, oh, wow, ooh, look at that.
I will admit that I did as well. When I first pulled it out of the little plastic, I was like, wait, is it not stapled to the rest of it? I was like, oh, wait, it's the map. And I was like, whoa, yeah. So,
mind blowing.
Anyway, it's the simple things. Anything else you want to say about this as far as stuff you liked?
I have a couple of questions for you, because you've played this and I have not.
Indeed.
So we've noted that it's quite a detailed, zoomed-in look at the locations inside this part of Xi'an. This seems like a level of detail that you, J. Cordova, tend to not like that much in published adventure material. So how did you find it to play with at this kind of level of ground level detail?
Okay, so I know why you're saying that, because we have had a long history of discussing role-playing game modules together, and I know where you're coming from by saying that. I think that the difference here... Okay, so it worked great. I loved it. The difference here is that first of all, it's the kind of detail that I actually like, which to say is it's well written. It's very fantastic. It's gross in places. It kind of hits a lot of the things that I really enjoy about like a really good module. And so I didn't mind the detail because I enjoyed reading it. Right. But also I think that we've already kind of noted, but like part of the reason why I don't love that detail is because it can be quite difficult to manage at the table, right? Mm-hmm. And as we've noted already, the structure of the keyed locations in this dungeon is such that it's very, very easy to work with. And so the detail actually serves a different purpose. It becomes more of like a way of pulling you into the setting, and you want to read it and you want to absorb it. And in a way, it's kind of like teaching you and inspiring you. And so I devoured this in one sitting, mostly because I had to, but also because I was really, really, into it. And I internalized all the good stuff, got it all like kind of, locked in place as far as like the themes and the vibe and the feeling and how I was going to role play various characters. I'm not going to do my white swine giggle, but it was pretty good and the players loved it. And I did all that. And I think without the detail, I wouldn't have been able to engage with it in the same way. Right. I don't like the detail that's boring, is basically my answer.
If you're going to do detail, make it good. I mean, that's not very helpful to the writers of the world.
This was one of my chain lightnings, but I'll go ahead and just spoil it now because I think it conveys my point. How many modules have we looked at, particularly older ones, but even some of the newer ones, where fully a third of the keyed locations have nothing going on in them? They're just empty rooms, right? It's a compulsion that module writers have for some reason, right? Like dungeons have to have empty rooms, otherwise it doesn't feel realistic or something. I don't know. But it's just paragraphs of like boring description of like nothing going on, right? This doesn't have that issue. There's a pantry entry. There's literally nothing to do. It's a pantry, but it's described with a couple sentences of really nice evocative detail. And so even though there's nothing going on there, it was fun to read, and it gave me a bigger picture of like kind of what the deal is, right? And so quality of writing matters. It's a thing. What's your other question?
Well, my other question is kind of, it goes to a broader level. So this is one part of the larger Xi'an setting. We know there's an issue 2 because we've got copies of it. Does this make you want to find out more about the setting and maybe come back and play through the issue 2 material based on what you've experienced here?
It does. I have not looked at issue 2 yet. I have it. It's still in the little Ziploc. I haven't opened it up yet. I do want to do it. I don't know if I'll be able to get this group reconstituted to do it again, to continue. A couple of those people are local and they've wanted to continue playing, and we've kind of got some stuff going, but I'm not sure like how much I can continue on from the story I was doing. But that's kind of an issue unique to our table and our circumstances. As far as like the actual, through Ultan's door, one of the things I found really interesting about reading the first issue is that I think Ben has a roadmap here, right? Like there are things hinted at in the lore, in that first part especially. There's a lot of like little things noted like that feel like kind of backstory or feel like things going on in other parts of the world. I think Ben has a roadmap for this. And so, yeah, I do want to see what happens next. And that actually kind of flows nicely into our expert delve. But yeah, so my answer is yes, I do. I will probably pick up issue 3 if there is an issue 3 and go through it. I'm not sure how functional these zines are as inspiration for other games because the setting does feel particularly bespoke. I mean, I think it's a cool product, and as long as it doesn't get too abstract and too surreal, I think I can hang with it.
All right, let's do some changes.
From the rumor table, quote, Ultan's cerebellum is clouded by violent vapors of black bile. Why, my friend once saw him proclaiming he had an earthenware head. Another time he said his innards were all the meat of pumpkins.
Also from the rumor table, perhaps the most on-the-nose treasure-hunting rumor ever, quote, my brother saw 3 hardened mercenaries go into the shop and come out again an hour later, larded with bags that clinked and jingled.
This description of the white swine, quote, the white swine are violent, cunning, and mischievous. They are always on the lookout for fresh meat for their mother, and detritus to bolster their nest. They see in the dark, and move with silence on their soft children's hands, although their giggling often betrays them.
I very much like the Weaver of Shadows, a demon of the Archon Asmarane, whose champion a player character might become. It's this sort of spidery figure lurking in the darkness, and I thought it was very Clive Barker-esque, which is pretty good.
The aforementioned dungeon pantry, quote, smoked haunches of white swine hang from hooks with other more dismal comestibles in wicker baskets, such as dried fungus and bitter catacomb berries.
And finally, the fruit that instills one with knowledge of the Byzantine criminal law of Zion. So it's got this indecipherable writing on the skin, so you know eating it's going to do something to do with knowledge, probably, but it turns out to be a surprisingly abstruse thing, which then even more surprisingly might actually be useful later. So that's a really good bit of random magical discovery.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Today we are talking about recapping at the beginning of a session, or kind of picking up where the adventure left off and how to kind of sell that. The reason why this topic came to me is related to what you asked earlier, Tom, which is Through Ultan's Door keeps going, right? Like we did issue 1, but there's another one, and we can't do them all, because we don't have that's outside the scope of the show, but we just did kind of a slice of it, right? And if I were to continue with issue 2, it probably won't be for another few weeks or months, and I would need a good way of getting the group back up to speed about what we did before. This is a topic. It's probably not going to take us very long to go through, but it's important. I think that it's one of those GM skills that is highly underrated. I know, like, there's certain things a GM can do that signal to me that they're a good, thoughtful GM. And one of the things is a very efficient way of recapping the previous session to get going in the next session, right? So I thought it would be fun to kind of talk about that. We've never talked about that specifically on the show, and I think it's a good skill to cultivate.
Yeah, I agree. I'm slightly wary of the subject because I think my approach is more art than science, so it's possible that my technique has massive flaws in it, but I think we will uncover the truth of that as we go along. I guess to kick off, what's your first concern when you start a second or later session, do you think, of an ongoing story?
Well, I think it actually starts with the prior session, right? This might sound like very, very obvious advice, but I have a gut feeling that not many people do it, which is you should make a few notes immediately after a session ends, like while everything is still fresh in your mind, okay? Sometimes I do this and sometimes I don't. And when I do, the recap and indeed my prep for the next session is 10 times easier. When I don't, I spend a lot of time just trying to remember basic ass details like NPC names, right? And so I think you can do yourself a huge favor, at least me, I can do myself a huge favor by immediately after the session is over, jotting down some notes about what happened so that you can refer to it when you're getting ready to prep and indeed do your recap for the next session. important NPCs that turned up, the names of those NPCs, significant encounters and obstacles that were overcome, kind of where is the story right now. It doesn't have to be a huge wall of notes, just a few little bullet points so that you can get yourself up to speed quickly, right? Because you have to get yourself up to speed before you can get the group up to speed.
Yeah, I tend to do my notes as I go along, so I'll write down an NPC's name when they appear in the story. But that has just made me realise one thing I do is I read back through it when I've finished, because sometimes someone that you introduced as a cousin of the Duke, that relationship or something might have changed by the end of the session, so you need to scribble things out and go like, actually his evil twin or something like that. So that is worth doing. And yeah, you're right, the idea of where the story has got to. If you're running something published, that can be as simple as writing down the page number that you're on, or like the last bit you did, which I find sometimes gets confusing, especially if the adventure is badly presented, as they sometimes are.
Yeah, so that first bit, that might just be, it could be a personal thing. Like, I don't take notes in the middle at all. Like, I don't note anything in the middle. Like, the players do. Like, the players usually have, like, notes, or if we're playing online, they have, like, tabs with, like, stuff they're doing. And I'm amazed by that. I'm like, oh, look at all these notes the players made. But, like, I don't. Because, like, when I'm GMing, it's just, my style is just to be, like, very, very locked into the performative part of it, right? And the sort of scene spotlighting and scene framing and stuff like that. So I just don't do it. So that's helpful for me. The actual, like, recapping the session or kicking off the new session, getting everybody up to speed. This is particularly important if you have a little break between sessions. If you're going week to week, it's not so bad. But if you got like 2 weeks, that's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that starts to really push up against like what people can remember, right? Like a lot of shit happens in your life in a few weeks, right? And it's easy to like lose track of a lot of stuff. So half the time I disclaim responsibility and just have the players recap, right? Filling in the gaps where needed. Usually what I usually do is I say, hey, each of you recap for your character. Like, tell me what happened to your character last time, right? And then I kind of fill in the gaps or correct things as I have to. The other half of the time, I do the recap entirely by myself. And those are two very, very disparate approaches. And the reason why they're so different and what affects the approach I choose depends a great deal on what type of game we're playing. So for games where players have a lot more control over the narrative, or where the gameplay is just inherently more collaborative, I almost always turn it over to the table for the recap, right? My best example here is Monster Hearts. Monster Hearts has a GM and it has players. It has a traditional GM players kind of role. But in my opinion, my function as the GM in that game is much more of like a co-player than a GM.
Yeah.
The players do a lot of the creation of the story, right? Like I mostly just call balls and fouls, and if they get a miss on a roll, I might like interject with some NPC or something. But for the most part, I'm like the setting and the NPCs, but as an equal to the players, right? Like we're all kind of just it's a co-equal thing, even though I have a different title and a different role. In that case, I think it's appropriate to have the players do the recap, talk about their characters. Monster Hearts is a great example here because Monster Hearts is not a game where there's like a goal. Like you're not trying to solve the dungeon or solve the mystery, right? You are just sort of meandering about being an asshole teenager, right? Mm-hmm. And because of that, it's not as important that the players have like all the stuff they need, right? Like in a mystery game, you can't start session 2 if you don't remind them about that very, very important thing in session 1 that they didn't follow up on, right? And so there's a little bit more pressure for the recap to be solid and thorough in a game that has more of an objective, right? So for those more like looser games, like more collaborative games, I think it's okay to have the players do it. For games that are more GM driven, or where the gameplay is about solving something or defeating something, like, defeating a monster in Monster of the Week, or investigating mysteries, that kind of thing, I tend to do the recap entirely by myself. I think that, like I kind of said earlier, when there's an objective to be done, you want to make sure that the players have what they need so they can kind of get going and accomplish the thing they're trying to accomplish, right? And I think it's better just for the GM to handle the recap in that way, because if you let the players do it, they're going to say wrong things, or they're going to focus on things that are not like important to the solving of the role-playing problem, right?
Exactly. Well, I think you can sort of afford to be like loose on some things and quite strict on others. Like what I often do is I'll get one player to do the recap in or out of character and let the others argue with them about the details. But then I will step in at the end with like corrections or like clarifications if it's about something that, as you say, is vitally related to their goal. For example, if they've forgotten the clue about where Dracula's lair is, I will mention that again, or sort of, remember you met this person who could tell you that, But Monster Hearts is a great example of, it's not that it's not important, but in some cases, seeing what they've forgotten can be instructive and useful.
It's negative space, right?
Well, yeah, for one thing, it's showing you what they're not interested in. Like if they remember the quirky blacksmith character, but they don't remember the evil knight, maybe the quirky blacksmith is the one to go with next time. But also, yeah, you could imagine a Monster Heartsy scenario in a D&D game. Let's say, doing the recap, one of the players says, "Oh yeah, that rival servant of mine totally blanked me at the party, and I felt really upset, and I'm going to get revenge." Now, it's possible that when you were playing that NPC, that's not at all what happened from your point of view, but there is no need for you to correct that misperception,
right? Yeah,
because that's interesting and fun, and it can come up organically in play. But yeah, as you say, if it's something about there's a magic jewel in the dungeon that kills anyone wearing a hat, you want to mention that before they all go down there wearing hats.
Right. Yeah, it definitely depends on the game you're playing for sure. And those are really, really good points. It's a good way of putting it. If we're going to kind of get to brass tacks here of like, okay, let's say you are going to be responsible as the GM for recapping the previous, what's come previously, the actual like mechanics of doing that. I have different ways of doing it depending on the type of game we're doing, which listeners might find helpful. So for NPC heavy games, I divide up the information. I do the recap by faction. I've talked about that on a previous episode. I don't remember which episode it was, but I'm sure some helpful listener will remind people somewhere. But what I do is I will like, I'll factionalize everything. Like, this is the group of people who are really interested in X. This is the group of people who are interested in Y. This is the group of people who want this from the player characters or whatever. And I kind of recap that way. This is particularly helpful for games like Urban Shadows, which is explicitly a factional kind of game, and indeed has tons and tons of NPCs. I find factional recaps to be a very good way of organizing that kind of information. For mystery games, I have a bit of a procedure here too. I start by restating the goal of the investigation, like this is what you're investigating, and then I just run through all the clues they've found so far. Once I've reminded them of all the clues they've found, I then note any possible avenues of investigation that they have yet to follow up on. That last bit's really important because I've had sessions go where I didn't do that. I didn't remind them of the thing they didn't follow up on last time. And there ends up being a bit of a breakdown in the investigation because, like, I remembered the thing, but they didn't remember the thing, and we kind of are spinning our wheels for a minute, right? So what's the investigation about? Here's the clues you found. Oh, and by the way, don't forget someone told you about the farmhouse over there and the library over there, right? And that also kind of gives them something to kind of like kick off with when they start. And then for adventure games and dungeon crawls, I always remind the group about the overall mission or the reason for being on the adventure. This is really important for campaign length games or games that go on for more than a couple sessions. It can be really easy to lose the thread of what we're actually meant to be doing over the course of multiple sessions, especially if they're good sessions, right? Especially if, you're encountering all kinds of cool monsters and stuff. If you're having all kinds of cool encounters and awesome combat scenes and all that kind of stuff, you can kind of forget like what you're doing while you're doing it, right? Like, it's good to kind of gently remind the group, about things like that, about the sort of overall thing. And then from there, I basically just run through highlights of what happened in the previous session. And I also, in that case, invite the players to recap for their character after I'm done. So I kind of give the big overall sweep of things. And then I ask them, so, what did you find interesting? Like, tell me about what your character got up to, right? And between that, we tend to cover all our bases. The last thing I would kind of add here for this expert delve segment is, if you have the right kind of table, meaning players who are into this, you can also ask the players what they'd like to see happen this session. That's not so much a recap, but it's a really, really good way of kicking things off. You kind of hinted at it a bit, Tom, by, letting the players kind of like do their own recap and say what they found interesting, which kind of clues you in on what to kind of go with and what to pursue. But you can be very explicit about it too if you have the right table and just say, all right, what would you like to see happen this session? when I say the right table, I mean a group of players who are accustomed to collaborative play, a group of players who are accustomed to jumping in and out of character. That's very, very important. My particular play culture that I have fostered over the years is one where we have a very, very hard break between in-character knowledge and out-of-character knowledge. And it's what I call like the writer's room approach to things. And so we can have like frank conversations about what we'd like to see happen to the characters because the players will sometimes say things that are challenging or difficult for the characters, right? And so, but that could be very, very helpful and lead to very, very satisfying outcomes because it just really, really puts things in focus for you as a GM, right? You can, you don't have to do what they say. You don't have to do the thing they want to see, but it's nice to kind of have an idea like what the players are interested in, right? So that you can all together, the players too can use that information as well. We can all kind of together get to the most satisfying outcome.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, with any game, you sort of implicitly asked before the first session by saying, hey, let's play this game, what everybody wanted to do. So there's no reason not to check in every so often and see how that's going. And then for the less collaborative story gamey crowd, simply asking, what's the plan? And not in the sense of, what's your tactical plan right now, but rather, what do you think is going to happen in this session is useful as well, because it's a great time to reassess what you were doing. You might be halfway through the quest to go and, kill the black dragon. But maybe in this session, you need to take stock of the situation and decide, that's not what we need to keep trying to do this session. This session needs to be the running away through the swamp session instead.
Right.
And this actually brings me to a recent kind of occurrence in my ongoing Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game, which has made it clear to me the beginning during the recap is a great time to own up to any mistakes you made last time and sort them out to fix them before continuing. So like the example here is, last session? In the preceding session, I had made a mistake about halfway through the module, and basically I'd misled the players by mistake. I'd sort of made them think that, there's nothing worth looking at in this room, when in fact that room contained the entrance to the dungeon. So then towards the end of the session, I overcompensated and essentially railroaded them back to the dungeon entrance and had them halfway down the staircase. And then, just before I started the most recent session, I was just like, I can't go on like this. This is, I've messed up, but I shouldn't force them to continue like that. That's not really fair and it's not fun. So I just told them what had happened. And I said, so do you want to keep going down the stairs or do you want to run away from the evil temple? Well, it's up to you. They went for running away. We had a good escape from the evil city session. They jumped off a bridge into a river. It was grand. And if I hadn't done that, I think we would have had a much more miserable time. So if something has gone slightly awry, just after the recap, I would say is the point to mention that and try and fix it with the group.
Awesome. Love that. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation. Listeners, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. In particular, if you have very practical advice for recapping previous sessions or presenting the new session or new adventure, I would love to hear that, because I think this is the kind of thing that, a lot of people, I think, know they should be doing and practicing or being conscious of, but kind of don't, Mm-hmm. And so, more ideas is always good. Let's go to the next segment.
Hey listeners, we have a couple of exciting things to tell you about. The first is that Codex Blood 3 is now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Blood 3 is 62 pages long and features some amazing stuff. Blood and Mirrors, a vampire hack of Ebediah Ravashal's Swords Without Master. The Caledonian Boar, a game of heroism and myth inspired by the story game classic The Final Girl. 3 Decisive Rounds, a 2-player game about a pair of boxers and their hardscrabble journey to the ring. The Giant's Carcass, a new expansion for Trophy Dark. And the new miscellany 3 Dozen More cult horror movies. The second thing that we want to tell you about is Brindlewood Bay. Brindlewood Bay is an original game that combines Murder, She Wrote style cozy mysteries with Lovecraftian horror. It's a full-sized, powered by the Apocalypse game coming to the Gauntlet Patreon feed in mid-January as a gift to folks who support us at the $6 or higher level. You'll get a PDF of the rules text, play sheets, and 5 mysteries, so you can start playing Brindlewood Bay right away. The game is another way for us to say thanks for all your support. There has never been a better time to be a Gauntlet patron. Head over to patreon.com/gauntlet to get Codex Blood 3 and Brindlewood Bay before they leave the feed.
It's the Companion Adventures. I'll tell you what, I had a hard time. I have stated that I don't care for dream world fiction, and so I was having kind of a hard time with coming up with good analogs here. I will say from a visual standpoint, I think movies like Pan's Labyrinth and The Cell are pretty good. I could take or leave either of those as far as stories or movies I want to watch.
The Cell is quite a bad film, but it is, yes, the visuals are.
Yeah. The Cell is like genuinely bad, but it is visually very, very beautiful. Pan's Labyrinth, I know a lot of people love that. I know why they love it. I'm not into the Guillermo del Toro like oeuvre. It's just never been my thing. I think he does like he wants to do horror, but it ends up being fantasy, and I dislike that. So, but visually they're very striking, and I think represent a nice, interesting, represent really interesting dream worlds. I know you had a similar suggestion. Right?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I think most of the film recommendations in this genre are going to be quite bad films, but they look good. Like, things like Nightbreed in a way would be in that genre, and then Mirror Mask is another looks good bad story one. So that's 2005, quite badly written, but the visuals are designed and directed by the artist Dave McKean. If you go on YouTube, there's a Mirror Mask visual highlights you can find that's floating around somewhere, so you can get like a good 10 to 15 minutes without having to actually sit through the movie.
Can I tell you the movie that will absolutely turn you off of dream world fiction, like 100%? And I think it's probably what happened to me, is What Dreams May Come. Have you seen What Dreams May Come?
Oh, no, it looked really boring, so I didn't bother.
It's wretched. It's so bad. And it's beautiful, stunning, like one of the most stunning, interesting, visually interesting movies I've probably ever seen. Just a terrible, terrible movie. And somebody will hate me for saying that, but I don't care. But it encapsulates like what I hate about this kind of fiction normally. Like, it's just so alienating. Like, I'm reminded, actually, okay, sorry, I'm really going off the
No, this is good.
There's an episode of This American Life, the podcast This American Life, but it's huge over here. But I remember, it's episode 511. I remember the episode number because I love this episode so much, where Sarah Koenig, who is the host of the very famous Serial podcast, she introduces the listenership to her mother, who is this very, very like posh, proper English woman, right? And her mother has 7 topics that one does not speak about, right? And for example, one of the topics is what she calls route talk, meaning talking about the route by which you got somewhere.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Right, like talking about your drive or talking about
one of my vows to myself as a child was I would never grow up to be the kind of adult I'd seen at barbecues discussing which motorway they used. Yeah,
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like so route talk. But one of her 7 things is dreams, talking about your dreams, and she's so right. She's like it's only interesting to you. It's completely boring for everybody else. And I feel like movies like What Dreams May Come and The Cell and others like have that same kind of like they do that to me. Like I have a hard time caring.
Lest we forget the Twilight novels were inspired by a dream. So.
Wow, we're making all kinds of fans today, aren't we?
Yeah, let's crash on before this gets any worse. I've got a TV recommendation, which is Neverwhere from 1996, created by Neil Gaiman and Lenny Henry. And again, this is another sort of, it's not strictly speaking a dream world, it's more like a Changeling the Dreaming wainscot fantasy thing, but also accessed via magic doors with lots of different factions, and they all live in London Below, which is sort of a parallel realm that exists inside the London Underground tunnels. And that was quite fun, although the special effects, even in 1996, were a little ropey.
Let's talk about some dream realm fiction I can get behind, hinted at by your fabulous intro today. The Twilight Zone. That is a fictional dream realm I'm into because the stories are grounded in something. They have something to say. They're not part of a big, like, crazy surreal universe that's at least presented in that way. So that's probably also makes it go down easier. But technically all these little stories are supposed to take place in this strange interdimension, right? And so, but I think what makes those stories like really powerful is they do have something to say, right? They are sort of like rooted in sort of social commentary. And I think that makes the strangeness, the sort of, it makes it go down easier. It makes the suspension of disbelief easier. So it even like papers over the, I mean, let's face it, the Twilight Zone has been around for a long, long time, and some of its conventions of its presentation don't hold up well over time, right? They're only 20 minutes long, right? And so they have to really hard frame, right? You want to talk about hard frame like a motherfucker. They have to hard frame right up to the story in the Twilight Zone, right? But the reason why they're still watchable today, and indeed, I just went to a 60th anniversary retrospective thing. They're still very watchable because they are kind of grounded in something, in a message.
When I was thinking about this as well, it's quite hard to recommend things in the same fantasy dream world setting. But there are lots of films that are good, but also completely inappropriate as setting companion adventures, but they have that kind of dream logic to them. So from things that actually are about being confused between the waking world and dreaming, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Invaders from Mars. Have you ever seen that? It's like a really...
I have not, no.
It's weird. It's like basically someone made a early 60s Red Scare alien invasion movie, but it was done by sort of weird surrealists from Europe, and so it's very odd. And then more modern things like Mulholland Drive or Upstream Color, where
I love those. Those.
If you attempt to sit down and explain what happened in that film, you would struggle, but they link together in ways that make sense on a sort of subconscious level, and that is difficult to do on purpose in a role-playing game, I would suggest, but I have previously claimed that it's possible at some length on this very podcast. So, yeah, I think it's worth kind of absorbing that kind of film and then just having it in the back of your mind.
Yeah. That's the thing. I feel like we're not being fair to like the idea of like dreaminess in games. I think what we're criticizing kind of is like just this idea of a dream world setting, right? Like that is hard to do. But yeah, so I imagine there's a very interesting long discussion about why I absolutely adore Mulholland Drive, but can't stand, Mirror Mask or The Cell. Anything else on your list?
I have one last thing, which the listeners will be pleased to know is less than 10 minutes long, although only, I think, by about 20 seconds. And that's a music video, the video for Black Star by David Bowie. It was on the very last album that he released before he died. And this one does fulfill the requirement for being interesting and strange and dreamlike, and you can find it online.
Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. The website is www.gauntlet-rpg.com. And we're on Patreon. If you love this show, please go support it on Patreon. It is patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you as ever to our... I was trying to think of very inappropriate adjectives.
Our dreamy editor.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks as ever to our outstanding editor, Luke Quaid. Goodbye.
Dream pudding, right?